I found a box of letters my mom left before she disappeared. Now my dad won't tell me the truth." Henry's hands were never still. Even in the silence of his garage, they searched for a task, a wrench to twist, a bolt to tighten, a memory to chase away. The faint scent of oil and rust clung to his overalls, as familiar as the ache in his back. It was easier to stay busy than to dwell on the hollowness of his home. The photograph on his workbench caught his eye again, as it always did. Melanie, 6 years old, with a toothy grin and a shock of unruly curls. Her arm was slung around his neck, as though he were her world. And in that moment, he was. That picture had been taken just weeks before Sarah had left, her departure as sudden as a summer storm. Henry let out a sigh and turned his attention back to the carburetor he'd been rebuilding. The past didn't need his attention today. There was enough work in the present. "Dad," a familiar voice called from the doorway. Melanie's voice had grown over the years, stronger, more confident, but to Henry, it still carried the echo of the little girl who had once clung to his pant leg. She stepped into the garage, bringing with her the warmth of the early afternoon sun. She was in her mid-20s now, her curls tamed but her spirit unbroken. Her eyes, though, carried a weight that made Henry pause. "Hey, kiddo," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "What brings you by?" Melanie hesitated, shifting on her feet. "I need to talk to you about something." Henry leaned against the workbench, crossing his arms. "Sounds serious." She bit her lip, a habit she hadn't outgrown. "It's about Mom." The air seemed to grow heavier, the hum of a distant lawnmower fading into the background. Henry's jaw tightened. "What about her?" She reached out to me," Melanie said, her voice soft but steady. "She wants to meet." Henry stared at her, the words sinking like stones into his chest. "And what did you say?" Melanie glanced away, her hands clasped in front of her. "I said I'd think about it." Henry felt a surge of emotions, anger, fear, betrayal, but he swallowed them down. "You're an adult," he said carefully. "It's your decision." "I know," Melanie said, her voice tinged with frustration. "But I wanted to tell you. I thought you should know." Henry nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thanks for telling me." The conversation lingered in the air as Melanie fidgeted with the hem of her shirt. "Dad, I don't know what to do. She's still my mom, but..." "She gave up that title a long time ago," Henry said, his voice firmer now. "You don't owe her anything." Melanie flinched at the sharpness in his tone. "I'm not trying to take her side. I just want to understand why she left." Henry's hands clenched into fists, the rag forgotten. "Sometimes there's no good reason. Sometimes people just leave." The garage fell into silence, the unspoken pain between them stretching like a canyon. Finally, Melanie stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm. "I'm not trying to hurt you, Dad. I need to figure this out for myself." Henry's gaze softened as he looked at her. She was so much like her mother, stubborn, determined, and full of questions. "I know," he said quietly. "Just be careful. Don't let her hurt you again." Melanie nodded, her expression resolute. "I won't." As she left, Henry turned back to the carburetor, but his hands didn't move. The photograph on the workbench seemed to mock him, a reminder of the family he tried so hard to hold together. He reached for it, his thumb brushing against the glass. "She won't hurt you," he muttered, more to himself than to the image. "Not again." Melanie sat in her car for a long time after leaving her dad's garage. The engine idled, humming softly, but her mind was anything but calm. She glanced at her phone lying on the passenger seat. Her mother's message stared back at her, a single text after over a decade of silence. "I'd like to see you, Mel. Please. I know it's been a long time, but I need to talk to you." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made her chest tighten. She hadn't replied yet. Every time her fingers hovered over the keyboard, her father's voice echoed in her mind. She gave up that title a long time ago. But what if there was more to the story? What if her mother's reasons weren't as black and white as her father believed? Melanie's thoughts churned as she pulled into the driveway of the small house she shared with her fiancé, Luke. The porch light was already on, casting a warm glow on the neatly trimmed yard. Luke opened the door before she reached it, his brow furrowed with concern. "Hey," he said, wrapping an arm around her as she stepped inside. "You okay? You've been quiet all day." Melanie leaned into his embrace, letting his steady presence calm her. "I told Dad about Mom." Luke stiffened slightly but didn't let go. How'd he take it? "Not well," she admitted, "but I didn't expect him to. He's still so angry at her." "Can you blame him?" Luke asked gently. "She walked out on both of you." "I know," Melanie said, pulling away to sit on the couch. "But she's reaching out now. Doesn't that mean something?" Luke sat beside her, his hands resting on his knees. "It depends on what she wants. Have you decided if you're going to meet her?" "I don't know," Melanie said, running a hand through her curls. "Part of me wants to hear her side, but I'm scared of what I'll find out. What if it changes everything I thought I knew?" Luke took her hand, his thumb tracing soothing circles on her skin. "Sometimes the truth hurts, but it's better than living with questions. Whatever you decide, I'll be here for you." Melanie offered him a small smile, grateful for his steady support. "Thanks, Luke." That night, as Luke slept beside her, Melanie found herself wide awake. She pulled a shoebox from the back of her closet, one she hadn't opened in years. Inside were letters, dozens of them. Most were from her mother, sent sporadically in the years after she'd left. Melanie had never replied to any of them. At first, she'd been too young to understand why her mother had gone. Then, as she grew older, her father's bitterness had shaped her perspective. The letters became a symbol of betrayal, and she'd shoved them aside, unwilling to face the emotions they stirred. Now, she unfolded the first one, dated just a few months after her mother's departure. "Dear Mel, I hope this letter finds you well. I miss you more than words can say. I know you must be angry with me, and you have every right to be. Leaving was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I felt like I had no other choice. Your father and we were broken, and I didn't want you to grow up in the middle of our fights. Please know that I never stopped loving you. You're my baby girl, and I think about you every single day. I hope one day you'll understand. Love always, Mom." The words blurred as tears filled Melanie's eyes. She set the letter aside and picked up another. Each one painted a picture of a woman wrestling with guilt and regret, but they also left questions unanswered. Why had her mother chosen to leave instead of staying to work things out? Why had she started a new life without looking back? Melanie tucked the letters back into the box and sat on the edge of her bed, staring into the darkness. She couldn't shake the feeling that meeting her mother might be the only way to find the answers she'd been avoiding for so long. Melanie decided to meet her mother the following weekend. They arranged to meet at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, far enough from familiar faces that the encounter wouldn't draw attention. Her hands trembled as she parked her car and stepped inside. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the warm aroma of baked goods, but Melanie's appetite had vanished. She scanned the room and spotted her mother immediately. Sarah looked different from how Melanie remembered, older, thinner, but undeniably the same woman. Her auburn hair was streaked with gray, and her eyes, once vibrant, now held a cautious sadness. "Melanie," Sarah said, rising from her seat. Her voice wavered with emotion, and she hesitated before pulling her daughter into a tentative hug. "Thank you for coming." Melanie nodded, unsure what to say. They sat across from each other, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. "You look so grown up," Sarah said, her eyes misting over. "I've missed so much." "You chose to miss it," Melanie replied, her voice sharper than she intended. Sarah flinched but didn't argue. "You're right. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know the truth." Melanie crossed her arms, bracing herself. then start talking. Sarah took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. I left because I thought it was the only way to protect you. Your father and I, we were in a bad place. He was so angry all the time, and I didn't want you to grow up thinking that was normal. Melanie frowned. Dad wasn't perfect, but he loved me. He still does. I know, Sarah said, her voice breaking, but you didn't see the worst of it. I tried to shield you from it, but I couldn't anymore. I thought leaving would give you a chance at a better life. Did it? Melanie asked bitterly, because all I remember is wondering why my mom didn't want me. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and she reached across the table, but Melanie pulled back. I made mistakes, Sarah admitted. I should have fought harder to stay in your life. But I'm here now, and I want to make things right, if you'll let me. Melanie stared at her mother, torn between anger and longing. Could she trust this woman who had already broken her heart once? The drive back from the cafe was a blur. Melanie replayed her mother's words over and over, trying to make sense of them. Her chest felt tight, like she was carrying a weight she couldn't put down. Luke was waiting for her when she got home, his face lighting up briefly before his smile faded at the sight of her expression. "How did it go?" he asked softly, pulling her into his arms. "She told me why she left," Melanie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She said it was to protect me from Dad." Luke frowned but said nothing, letting her continue at her own pace. "She said he was angry all the time, that it wasn't safe for us to stay together," Melanie explained, her voice trembling. "But that's not the Dad I knew. He's always been strict, sure, but he's never hurt me." Luke's grip on her tightened. Sometimes parents keep things hidden to protect their kids. Maybe there's more to the story. Melanie pulled back, her eyes searching his face. But what if she's lying? What if she's just trying to justify abandoning me? Luke sighed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Only you can decide what you believe, Mel. But maybe it's time to ask your dad about it." Melanie's stomach churned at the thought. Her father wasn't the type to talk about the past, especially not when it involved her mother. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to hear his side. Again. The next day, Melanie drove back to her father's house. The garage door was open, and he was bent over the hood of an old pickup truck, his hands covered in grease. "Hey, Dad," Melanie called, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. He glanced up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Hey, kiddo, you here to check on me again?" "Something like that," she said, stepping closer. "Can we talk?" Her father's brow furrowed, but he nodded, leading her into the house. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where countless family dinners had taken place before her mother left. "I saw Mom yesterday," Melanie began, watching his reaction carefully. His jaw tightened, and he leaned back in his chair. "I figured you might." "She told me why she left," Melanie continued, her voice hesitant. "She said it was because of you. That you were angry all the time. That it wasn't safe." Her father's face darkened, a flicker of pain crossing his eyes before he masked it with a scowl. "Did she now? Is it true?" Melanie pressed, her heart pounding. Were things really that bad? Her father sighed heavily, running a hand over his face. "I won't lie to you, Mel. Your mom and I fought, a lot. I was working long hours, stressed about money, and I didn't handle it well. But I never laid a hand on her, and I damn sure never hurt you." "Then why would she say that?" Melanie asked, her voice rising with frustration. "Why would she make it sound like she had no choice?" "Because she's trying to make herself feel better," he said bitterly. "She wants you to believe she left for some noble reason, but the truth is, she couldn't handle the pressure. She ran because it was easier than staying and fighting for our family." Melanie stared at him, her mind spinning. Both of her parents had told her their version of the story, but the pieces didn't fit. Who was telling the truth? Or was it possible that both of them were hiding something? "I don't know what to believe anymore," she admitted, her voice breaking. Her father reached across the table, his rough hand covering hers. Believe this, Mel. I've always done my best for you. Everything I've ever done was to give you a good life. Melanie nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. But deep down, she knew this conversation hadn't given her the clarity she needed. It had only deepened the divide between her memories and the truth. A week later, Melanie sat alone in her living room, staring at the shoebox of letters again. Her mother's words haunted her, but so did her father's. There was something they weren't telling her, something that neither of them wanted her to know. Driven by a mixture of desperation and determination, she decided to dig deeper. She spent hours combing through old photo albums, legal documents, and anything else she could find that might hold a clue. Finally, tucked away in the back of her father's filing cabinet, she found a stack of papers that made her heart stop. They were court documents, custody agreements, restraining orders, and police reports. The reports detailed domestic disturbances, allegations of verbal abuse, and one incident where her father had allegedly punched a hole in the wall during an argument. Melanie's hands shook as she read through the pages. The reports painted a picture of a man she barely recognized, a man who was angry and out of control. But they also included statements from neighbors who claimed her mother had exaggerated the situation, that she was the one who often instigated fights. It was chaos, messy, complicated, and impossible to sort into clear lines of right and wrong. Melanie sank onto the floor, clutching the papers to her chest. Her parents' marriage had been a battlefield, and she had been caught in the crossfire. No wonder the truth felt so elusive. Both of them had been fighting their own demons, and neither had been willing to admit their part in the fallout.